In this short podcast, I'm going to talk through the key features of the Berlin Crisis. So the Berlin Crisis spans from 1958 to 1961, and it centres around the four summits that take place between the countries of the USA and the USSR, and what was agreed, what was disagreed, and how this event could ultimately have led to a World War III, a nuclear exchange, but is saved in August 1961 by the construction of a Berlin Wall. So, when you think of Berlin and the Berlin Crisis, there's a couple of key terms you need to get your head around. Firstly, refugees. East Germany, after the end of the Second World War, the communist East Germany does not grow economically at the same rate as West Germany. There are still, for example, bomb sites in East Berlin. East Berlin, of course, is the communist zone within Berlin. Berlin lies deep within the Soviet zone, but there's this small western enclave, because Berlin was divided after the Second World War. And East Germans can see the benefits of living in the West. If they were to walk into West Berlin, there would be Coca-Cola signs, there would be a high standard of living, good job prospects. So in the late 1950s, 2.7 million refugees leave East Germany for a better life in West Germany. And this is a huge public relations disaster for communism. And of course, the Soviet Union. And their new leader, Party Secretary Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, eager to get the West out of Berlin, makes a 6-month ultimatum. That's the word you could use, ultimatum, to the Americans, to leave West Berlin and to hand it over to the East German authorities, so that East Germany is unified and the city itself lies as the capital of East Germany without any Western occupation. So he's raising the stakes, and that's a deliberate plan ploy by Khrushchev. So what we see, in Khrushchev's wanting to see how the US respond to this, are a series of conferences and summit meetings. I think as a summit of a mountain, when you have a summit, the very top, a summit is where the top leaders meet to try and solve the problems of the day. And we have summits today on climate change, on health issues, on terrorism. And so the summits that were held in the late 1950s were about the issue of Berlin. The first summit is held at Geneva in May 1959, and what that summit does is to pave the way for the big leaders to come to, when they knew that Khrushchev was going to visit the United States later that year in September 1959. So what Geneva does is pave the way, set the kind of agenda for what the big leaders are going to talk about in September 1959. So when Khrushchev visits America, he's taken to the presidential retreat out of Washington to a place called Camp David. That's not the name of a person, that's the name of the presidential summer retreat. And although nothing's agreed at Camp David in September 1959, anything massively, Khrushchev does agree to withdraw his ultimatum. And the US President Eisenhower and Khrushchev agreed to meet again at Paris in about 18 months' time. However, in the third summit in Paris in May 1960, the situation has changed massively. There was the growing arms race, and just through sheer unfortunate bad luck, you could say, but a U-2 spy plane flying over the Soviet Union was shot down, and its pilot was captured, Gary Powers, and Khrushchev storms out of the Paris conference in anger because the USA refused to apologise. And you can kind of see Khrushchev's point. What it means for the Berlin crisis is that sore, that ulcer that is Berlin, is still not healing. And refugees are still fleeing to the West, and tensions are rising. So eventually Khrushchev calms down, and there is another meeting, this time in Vienna in June 1961, but there is a new president, John F. Kennedy. And he's kind of bullied at the Vienna conference because Khrushchev, he's been in power 5 or 6, 7 years. Kennedy's kind of taken aback by the demands that Khrushchev is making. And because what's back on the table is this 6-month ultimatum that the US have to get out of Berlin or expect consequences to that. So Kennedy goes away from this meeting very shaken. They don't pull their forces out. The 6-month ultimatum comes and goes, But what we do see is that Kennedy publicly announces a massive increase in the build-up of conventional weapons. That is, soldiers building up of the army, the air force, and the navy, constructions of nuclear submarines. But significantly, he orders $207 million to be spent on the creation of nuclear fallout shelters, and that sends a very clear message to the American people that there could be nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So things aren't looking too good. Berlin is still an issue until that is August 1961. Now Khrushchev at this time is really stuck because he knows that if there is a nuclear war with the USA in the summer of 1961, America has many more nuclear warheads than the Soviet Union, and therefore they would lose a nuclear exchange. American bombs can reach Russia, but in 1961, the Soviet Union don't really have an effective delivery system to rain down atomic weapons on the USA. And he couldn't now force the USA to leave Berlin. They're just not going to go. So but there's still a refugee crisis. So what we see, the solution is the construction of a wall. Now the textbook says that it's the Soviet Union that constructs this wall, but actually it's the East Germans. It's the East German army, it's the border guards, begin firstly constructing barbed wire fences, and if you look in your textbook there's some very graphic images of this wall hastily being erected. And so Berliners find themselves almost overnight, over in mid-August, seeing this wall being constructed, and you see people trying to quickly get through to the west before that option to become a refugee in West Germany closes. And so we have this weird situation in Berlin where there's a wall running right the way through the city. I should have said right the way around one half of the city. And in many ways, Kennedy commented that, okay, a wall isn't ideal, but a wall at least is better than a war. And that's what the Berlin Wall does. It really solves the Berlin crisis. That no more refugees. Okay, the West aren't going to leave, but at least it almost like contains them within this very narrow, small part of Berlin. And the wall stays there now right up until the late 1980s, almost until the end of the Cold War, when the wall is pulled down in the when communism leaves Eastern Europe. For America, it's seen as a great propaganda success. Kennedy visits West Berlin and gives a very famous speech. The mayor of West Berlin at this time goes on to become the leader of West Germany in the late 1960s. And there we have it. Berlin remains divided, but the wall becomes a symbol of this Cold War era. So there we have it. The causes: the refugee crisis, public relations disaster for Russia, the summits which failed to come up with a solution, and ultimately the solution is a wall. And what the wall does is that it prevents the Berlin crisis becoming potentially a war between the two powers. So for GCSE, that's all you need to know about the Berlin crisis. Okay.